Welcome to the Southern Report. And once again, thank you for giving me the privilege of your time, your company, and your viewing. It is much appreciated. Please click like, subscribe, follow. I will be very indebted to you. So continuing my political series, where I have the privilege of interviewing Reform UK prospective parliamentary candidates for the up-and-coming election that has to be recalled by January 2025. I'm extremely honoured to welcome Nick Taylor, who is the prospective parliamentary candidate for Norfolk. And as usual, in our own style, we will give you a geography lesson and wonderfully explain where the beautiful place of Norfolk is, Norwich, and where the constituency is, and more importantly as well, get to know Nick and why he is standing for reform in Norfolk constituency. Nick, thank you so much for joining me on the digital medium. I'm going to punch us in and so we can see each other a bit more close up. Nick, thank you very much for your time, sir.
Well, thank you for having me. And just a little correction. I'm not standing in North Norfolk. It's an easy mistake to make.
Of course,
Norwich North.
Norwich North. Well,
my good friend Jason Patchett is standing in North Norfolk. And I'm pleased to say we have candidates in 8 of the 9 Norfolk seats, and we will soon have a full complement.
That is very, very encouraging, and I will be interviewing Jason, so thank you for that, and thank you for that correction. Is more importantly, it comes out of your mouth because you know where the constituency is, and then it confirms where you're actually standing. Nick, getting straight into it, why are you standing for Reform UK in the constituency that you are? How long have you lived in that constituency, and what has brought you to this decision?
Well, I've lived in Norfolk for 28 years, and I've lived in Norwich for 21 years. So, yeah, I've lived here a long time. I'm not going anywhere in a hurry. I've started a business here in Norwich. I've started my family here in Norwich, and they've grown up, and I'm now a man of a certain age, and we all need things to drive us on in life. I've been interested in politics and current affairs all my adult life. And you probably heard this many times before from Reform candidates, that we are not career politicians. We do not seek position. We didn't grow up seeking power. We all feel compelled to do this. And we feel compelled to do this because of the state of our country. And we feel there are threats to our country, to our culture, to our society, to our economy, to democracy. And we feel we can't just stand aside. I have 2 sons, and I want them to have the sort of life in their 20s and 30s that I had. And I fear that time is running out for them to do that, and for their generation to be able to buy a property, have a good job, not be worried about paying their fuel bills, not be worried about starting a family because of the costs, basically to enjoy the type of life that I did. And you would have heard that from pretty much all the candidates you've talked to from Reform.
You're right. There is a theme that is building. So, Nick, and I know there is a very, very nice picture of a high street behind you, and I'm going to tie it in. And I just wondered if you could very kindly place that picture and for me now. Just tell us what that picture is.
Well, I'm sitting in my office, and that's a picture of Rampant Horse Street, as it was about 130 years ago, in turn of the century Victorian Edward in England. It doesn't look like that anymore, but it's a lovely picture. That street still exists, but it's changed quite a bit.
what changes have come to that street? And you can see the direction I'm going to go in travel, because it neatly segues into talking about changes. So what changes have come to that particular street, that high street, over the last 130 years? What does it look like now?
Well, it always was a retail district. What it was at the time of that picture. I didn't know you were going to ask this question, but it is interesting because the building on this side in recent years has been a department store, which of course is now defunct. It was Debenhams, and that's gone. And that building is still empty. I suspect there are some plans for what that building will be in the future, but it's a sign of the, what's happened to the high street in every town and city across the country. And that decline has come for many, many reasons. One reason is online shopping. If you want to use Amazon, that's great, but you won't have a high street. You'll have a corporation that sucks up all that business, hardly pays any tax in this country. And if you think that's a good thing, well, go ahead, but I don't. Of course, out-of-town shopping centres is another reason why our high streets have declined. But I dare say that street and the streets in that area of Norwich are less prosperous than they used to be.
Hence why I've answered the question, because then again, that is also a theme that has come up with other candidates, that they have talked about the decline of their high street retail access in the communities that they are part of, in the constituencies that they are standing for. And it's not quite the right word, but in one sense, I'm saying it media wise, it's a wonderful illustration of that, but it's also a very sad illustration of that. And we all know the history of Debenhams, for argument's sake, and that has gone on up and down this country. Just out of interest, how long has that building stood empty? How long ago did they disappear from the high street?
I think that building has probably stood empty for about 2 years. Right. And it's quite a handsome landmark building, and could be put to many uses. I guess the other reason for the decline of the high street in Norwich is Norwich City Council, which is dominated by Labour and the Greens, and they have a very distinct anti-car policy. So if you're able to walk into the city, you can. If you're unable, as many people are, it's that much more difficult. And certainly the city has been in decline commercially in recent years, partly due to the difficulty in parking. Parking is very expensive and in shorter and shorter supply. Again,
that conversation is coming up, and the importance of asking you about that building in your constituency then moves us on to saying what you've just raised concerns that people are seeing. They're seeing the decline of their high street, and without telling you the obvious, and it's saying this to everyone else. Of course, if a big retailer like that goes, then other little shops are dependent on them as well, because if people are going into Debenhams for one thing, they will then go into another shop for something else. That is what was the bedrock of our communities. So Nick, what are the concerns that the constituents, the people there are talking to you about? What are their major concerns on a macro level? What retail politics can you take on to say, I will work hard to solve this?
Well, you see, prospective parliamentary candidates of whichever party will ask themselves, what are the local issues? And what are the national issues? And I have to say, this time around in this election, the issues are so bad nationally that the vast majority of people I speak to in Norwich North are concerned about the big issues, the cost of living, the inflated cost of energy. We pay more for our energy than any other country in Europe. They're concerned about mass immigration and the effect it has on housing, on public services, the pressure it puts on the benefit system, the pressure it puts on infrastructure. They're increasingly concerned about big government and lack of sovereignty, erosion of democracy. These are the big issues. But of course, there are local issues as well. But some of those local issues tie in, as always, to some of the national issues. So, for example, there are parts of Norwich, I'm particularly looking at maybe NR3, NR1. There are areas where we have daylight drug deals on street corners, daylight muggings, an epidemic of shoplifting, which is quite shocking because Norwich has always been a fairly low crime city in past decades, but it is starting to take on a distinct different colour altogether. And people are really concerned about this. Now, so locally, what can an MP do about that? Well, I think you can bring pressure to bear on the Police and Crime Commissioner. You can bring pressure to bear on the Chief Constable. We need more policemen visible on the streets, particularly at certain times of the day and particularly in certain parts of the city. Every other political party, and I've been to a hustings only last month, so I know what they think because this question came up. They don't think that more policing is the answer. They think that we should attack the reasons why people are becoming lawless. Now, we need to do that too, but we need more police on the street. We need a justice system that is determined to present criminals with a deterrent, and we don't have that at the moment. So that's one thing I will be looking at. Other parties just think that shoplifting is a consequence of poverty. Now that's a huge insult to millions of poorer people in this country who are honest, and I just don't agree with that. So I think we need deterrence and we need police presence. The other big driver for me in Norwich is we have very expensive council tax. Council tax in Norfolk is more expensive than Cambridgeshire. It's more expensive than Suffolk. It's more expensive than Lincolnshire. It's more expensive than Bedfordshire. I haven't looked at any other further afield, but we have to ask the question, and this is what reformers do. They're critical thinkers, and when presented with something, they ask, why is that? Well, why is our council tax so expensive compared to other counties and other similar rural counties? And so our council taxpayers, whether they're in the county or in the city, are they getting value for money? And I'm a council taxpayer. I pay far too much for my council tax. I do not think I'm getting value for money. And there are lots of reasons. I'd like to explore what they are. But of course, until you see the books of Norwich City Council, which is dominated by Labour and the Greens, and until you see the books of the County Council, which is dominated by the Conservatives, you don't really see the nitty-gritty. But for example, the County Council reside at County Hall rather, which is on the outskirts of the city. It's a huge monolithic building on a huge campus site. If you go in there, you won't find many people working in there because they're all working from home. Do they need this campus? Could they be working more efficiently at a business park? They probably could. Could they save council taxpayers a vast amount of money? The City Council occupy another landmark building. It's built in the 1930s. It's monolithic. It's a landmark. It was on Hitler's list of buildings that the Luftwaffe should not bomb because he was very taken with 1930s architecture. If you go in there, it's full of fresh air. It's not full of people. Why does the council taxpayer have to keep maintaining this building? These are the questions I would ask.
again, and I commend you for this in your knowledge immediately and how you are joining the dots, because there is a theme that's coming out. I will having the privilege to interview Martin York up in Cheshire area, and he was saying the same thing about council tax, council spending, how they would then appoint people, doing that through agencies. But the fact you're then paying a council leader temporarily £400,000 and then that coming down to £200,000. So there are a number of things that are building up that where many people are on the same page. You talk about, sadly, you're talking about the crime, and I'm quite, having known Norwich, you're absolutely right in what you picture. Have they seen a vast reduction of police men and women on the street? When you talk about the police commissioners, that's another layer of management. How can we take this management out? But has there been a reduction of policemen and women on the street? Is it relying on police cars? Are they going from one constituents to another? And I'll just end with this. We do know, sadly, that under Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary, she oversaw a reduction of police numbers across the country. She was asked to reduce that. Your comments on that, and also how are people finding access to doctors' surgeries? Is there enough infrastructure in regard to hospitals, housing, etc.? Take us in that direction as well, Nick.
Well, again, the local picture here is repeated all over the country. So the local issue is a national issue. And if you take a rural county like Norfolk, the police are very, very thinly positioned around the county. So much so that police officers are actually often in a dangerous situation because they can be on their own or with a colleague and be very isolated if help is required. And they all have a red emergency button on their kit. But the response time, of course, because it's a big county, the response time is far too much. And it's because they're too thinly spread about. So yes, anecdotally, there has been a reduction in police presence. Now, when I was a lad, and when you were a lad, a policeman was a physical presence. Mm. It was usually a policeman. There were clearly some women, and there was a height requirement. So you had to be 6 foot tall. A policeman was a physical presence. So, for example, if you had a gathering of 200 or 300 brick throwing demonstrators, the blue line was able to defend the line. It's not able to do that anymore because it no longer has a real presence. But it's about numbers. And I have great sympathy for police officers. I feel they are lions led by donkeys. And we really need to look at policing. And again, that is replicated around the country. Now, you asked about GPs. GPs are amalgamating. They're being taken over by bigger organisations. It's hard to get a GP's appointment. If you go to A&E, well, I say to my wife, do you really want to go to A&E? Because you'll wait there for, 8 or 9 hours. And you need to think really long and hard as to whether you want to go. I'm a bit stubborn. I don't go perhaps when I need to, and but that's common for all of us. The Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, which is, there are 3 main hospitals in Norfolk. The Norfolk and Norwich is the biggest and the newest, and it was built about 22 years ago. And it was built for a population of a certain size. Now, clearly, only 2 decades later, it is having bits bolted onto it at a rate of knots, because in just 2 decades, the population that it serves has grown vastly. And again, this is replicated all around the country. And that hospital is something I rely on personally. You know, I visit there far too often, but that's just the way life is. That's just my particular situation. And whenever I am treated there, I get excellent service by excellent people. Again, they're lions led by donkeys. That hospital should have been built to accommodate a much bigger population, and it wasn't. So we have to extend it over and over again. So that's the state of the NHS in Norfolk. And millions of ordinary people up and down the country are going private, not because they can really afford it, but because they are so desperate to have their knee done or their hip done or their whatever else they need doing. And they're raiding their savings and their pension funds to go private.
I hear you. You are wonderfully bringing in the national issues. I mean, we are very, very concerned about the national issues. We can't avoid them because you're quite right. They are similar, incredible conversations, and privileged to have that with other candidates up and down the country. As I say, I underline this. There is this theme. At this point, Nick, could you tell everyone how they could reach you? How they could contact you by email, phone, etc. If you could just draw people's awareness to that, that would be great.
Well, they can reach me on email. They can also. I'm also on TikTok. I'm a 60-year-old on TikTok. You know, never thought that would happen to me, but that's the truth. We have a Facebook page. Yeah. We have an X page, although I don't do much on X, and we have an Instagram page. So if you search for Norwich North on Facebook, on Instagram, or on TikTok, you can find me, and people can email me. You
have through your work, you have a position on the high street, which means that you are in contact with the public. So what other concerns with that you? Quite rightly, you've talked about the police numbers, etc. How the thin blue line is stretched. You and I have grew up in the era of Dixon and Dot Green and Z cars. If we're looking at media-wise, that dates us. But there's also something I think wonderfully dates us. But sadly, we see how things have changed. You've talked about the strain to actually find a GP, to actually get an appointment. Also, the hospital that is under strain and is having to do bolt-ons and bolt-ons and bolt-ons. How much has what other issues have come about due to the population expansion? What about housing? Are new houses being built? Are they being built for locals to be able to afford them? What about the other infrastructure, Nick, within your constituency?
Well, these issues with whether it be policing or health services or any other public service are all under strain because of rapid population growth. Now, the birth rate, as you know, has not been increasing. In fact, it has been decreasing. So rapid population growth over the last 20 years is due almost entirely to mass immigration. And you know Reform's policy on this. We believe, like 68% of people in this country when polled believe, that we have to have much, much less immigration. This desire has been ignored by the Tories for 14 years. It was introduced, of course, mass immigration by Labour, so they're in favour of it too. But no one's voted for this. You know, it's a policy that's been foisted upon us. It's never been in any party's manifesto. You know, we will rapidly increase the population through immigration. This has never been proposed, so we haven't been able to vote for it. In fact, we thought we might have voted for the opposite because, of course, having less immigration has been in lots of manifestos. When it comes to housing, I know a lot about housing, and housing is very, very expensive. I fear that my sons will not be able to afford to buy a property. At the moment, I'm paying for one son to be at university, and the rent is horrendous. It's not just the cost of the rent, it's the stress of finding a suitable property and trying to get ahead of the queue for that property. And as a parent, it's quite stressful because, of course, you're paying, but your child is the one that's actually in the contract. So I know all about the cost, and I know all about the stress and I have one or two properties myself that I let. And when I let them, there is a queue of people wanting to rent that property. So why are property prices and rents so high? Well, there's lots of drivers for that. Interest rates is a driver. Income multiples used to be a driver, but it's not anymore. The market has changed. It's all about supply and demand. Price is dictated by supply and demand. It is not dictated by income multiples or affordability. It's all about supply and demand. And when you don't have enough supply, in a good year, we build 160,000 homes. It's a fantasy to think that we can build 300,000 homes a year. So at 160,000 homes, is that enough to keep up with demand? No, it's not. It's a fraction of what we need to accommodate 745,000 extra people, which is what net immigration was at the last count in a single year. So of course it doesn't work. All other parties deny any connection. I know this because, again, I was at a hustings last month. I was up against Clive Lewis. I was up against another Labour candidate for Norwich North, a Liberal Democrat, and a Conservative. None of these parties will make any connection between pressure on public services, pressure on infrastructure, pressure on the benefit system, and particularly pressure on the housing system with rapid population growth. They deny there is any connection whatsoever. Their solution is just to build more houses, as if they think somehow that's going to keep up with demand. First of all, it won't keep up with demand. Secondly, it is environmentally hugely damaging to build a single house, let alone 160,000 a year. Locally, we have a problem with nitrates. We have a problem with flood risk. We have a problem with loss of habitat and loss of wildlife. These are all caused by turning over green land and making it into a housing estate. So in answer to your earlier question, housing has been bolted onto Norwich on the outskirts, not so much in the city. We've got very few brownfield sites. We've got a few left. This is where houses should be built, brownfield sites, and those houses should be social housing. They should be small 1 and 2, 3 bedroom units. What is being built is what developers want to build. There ain't no town planning in it. So developers want to build what makes them the most profit. And it's on the outskirts of town, it's on greenfield sites, and outside every one of those nice 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom houses, there are 2 or 3 cars, and all of those cars travel into Norwich at some point during the day. Environmentally, that's very bad. It's very bad for our countryside. We need our countryside for growing food because we are very dependent on imports. We have to be much more food self-sufficient. And if it's not used for growing food, it should be used for planting trees. Because if you're serious about the environment, planting trees is one of the simplest and cheapest solutions. Maybe because it's cheaper, the corporations aren't interested in it.
When you were at the hustings, Nick, why do you think that the Tory party, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Greens will not face the reality of the issue on the ground that's staring them in their face? I wonder why. What is your opinion of why they will not face the blooming obvious?
It's not because they're stupid. These people are not stupid. I didn't encounter any stupid people at the hustings. It's because they don't care. They just don't care. And that's why they will not admit the connection. They are so determined. The Tories see immigration as a way of growing the economy. And to a certain extent, they're right. Labour always saw mass immigration as a way of growing the vote. Tony Blair introduced our country to mass immigration. Before Tony Blair, we had immigration, because Reform UK are not against immigrants. We're not against immigration. We are against the policy of mass immigration. It's a very, very different thing. Before Tony Blair, we had 10, 20, 30,000 net a year increase. This was manageable. It was sustainable, and it was in most cases desirable for our society and our culture and our economy. But the moment you make that 200,000 or 300,000 a year, and under the Tories up to 700,000 a year, it's clearly nuts. But these parties won't make the connection. Tony Blair did it for two reasons, and I quote from someone in his inner circle at the time: he wanted to rub the nose of the right in diversity. This was very ideological. The second reason he did it is because he knew that 80% of immigrants vote Labour. He was growing the vote share. He also grew the vote share by sending more people to university, where they could be indoctrinated. He also grew the vote share by expanding the state. People who work for the government tend to vote Labour. So it's he did enormous damage to our country, but he was an excellent and very effective politician.
You've laid out, in my opinion, some very, very important history that has to be constantly laid out. And you've as a number of us, we look back, and of course we're joining the dots. You've said a very, very important thing, which is ideology. You've laid out where the houses are being built and where they are not being built, and the brown sites not being used, and sadly being built in the green belt, in the area where we need that area to produce food. Has your constituency got fields and fields, as the wonderful Robert Reaney, the constituent in Derbyshire, Bolsover, described as double glazed fields? Do you have a lot of double glazing in the fields around you?
You mean solar panels? Solar panels.
Yeah.
Well, my constituency is clearly the northern side of Norwich. So we have 4 wards that are city wards, which are, Victorian, Edwardian, terrace housing, close to the city. You could walk to work, you could walk to the shops, you can walk to the park. And then in addition to those 4 city wards, we have 9 county wards. And they are the suburbs. They're the suburbs, and one of them is Thorpe St Andrew, Catton, Helston, Drayton. And they're the burbs. And then it stretches out into semi-rural as you get further out. So no, we don't have wind turbines and fields of solar panels. But it's a very hugely different type of person that lives in the 4 city wards than the 9 county wards. The 4 city wards are dominated by Labour and the Greens. It's very hard for the Tories, and it's very hard for Reform UK to get any traction there. And I found this out at the local elections, which, as you know, were metropolitan areas. So for us, it was only in Norwich, only in those 4 wards, and in Norwich South, in the wards that they're city wards. But the voting pattern in the 9 county wards is completely different. The Greens are nowhere. The Liberal Democrats are nowhere. It's dominated by the Tories, although this time around, it's going to be very interesting. Labour are making a big play for Norwich North. It's been a bit of a seesaw. It's been in Tory control for certainly a dozen years. Before that, it was a Labour seat.
You're describing different areas. Again, you're describing ideology, how people view things from an ideological point of view. And of course, some people may say to us, well, you're the age you are, you know, we're actually, you need to move on. And in that context, we remember the Brexit vote of 2016. How was that reflected in the area where you are living now? How was that reflected? How many people voted out? What was the Remain? What was the Leave division?
Well, in the four city wards, which are still dominated by Labour and the Greens, 3 of those were Remain and 1 was Leave. And in the 9 county wards, all but 1 were Leave. So again, a very clear dividing line between, you know, the urban area and the suburban area. Yeah. And again, the city wards have a younger demographic, so you can understand why they think differently. But they've also been targeted for many, many years by Labour and more recently by the Greens. You see, Norwich, the Greens are clever. You know, they focus their resource on their heartlands, and they regard their strongholds as Brighton and Bristol and Norwich. So the Greens are big here, and but only in the city. Out of the city, it's blue all the way to the sea.
How come that Norwich then has become one of their strongholds? I mean, I know the other areas extremely well, particularly Brighton, but how come Norwich has become one of their strongholds then?
I don't know how it started, but certainly there has been a gradual change. The city council used to be always dominated by Labour. The Liberal Democrats do well in the city in one particular ward, and they deserve it because they work very hard at it, you know. But slowly but surely, the Greens have been infiltrating those city wards, making their case and winning wards. And so that Labour don't get it all their own way anymore in Norwich. It's very much, I think they still hold a majority on the city council, but they're reaching a time when they're going to have to, you know, think hard about how they continue, because the Greens are almost reaching parity.
Right. As Rob Rooney was laying out when I interviewed him and for his constituency in Bolsover, he was saying, because as you've laid out, with all the county councillors, then the police commissioners, and the fact that there is all this divide all up between different parties, you've laid that out. Have you got the same situation where, when people have council responsibility, they have responsibility on the ground for providing services, that because they are members of a particular party, are they talking to the other parties, or ideologically they won't cross over those lines at all?
Well, they're influencing policy, aren't they? They're not actually delivering services at the coalface. Do they have cross-party issues they work on? I'm sure they do, but there's an enormous amount of you know, sticking to one's own camp, sticking to one's own ideology. I'm sure, and you know, can I see, you know, Labour working with Reform if we win local representation? I don't know. I would hope so. But again, the other, as you've heard before, and as we like to tell people, you know, what are the key differences between Reform and the establishment parties? Well, Britain and the British are at the core of everything we try to do. Not unelected supranational organisations, not unelected courts, not corporate interests. The British and Britain, and if you take that down, the taxpayer. Who is at the centre? The taxpayer. The taxpayer is the customer. And that comes down to, on local level, the council taxpayer is the customer. So I would like to think if we win power locally in Norwich or in the county, because the county elections are next year, that, you know, we can bring that to bear and ask for better value for money for council taxpayers. I mean, in City Hall or in County Hall, do they ever think what is best for the customer? I'm just not sure they do. I just don't think they see us in that light at all.
I think what you've just said is wonderfully expressed, because they're not sitting back going, well, how can we then, tell me if I'm wrong, how can we serve our customers to the best of our ability? They don't answer that question. Is that because it's always seen through ideology? The ideology comes first and then just go, well, you'll just have to put up with it. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I just think this is very, very important.
I think it comes down to, you know, when people win an award in the city council elections, or they win an award in the county council elections, often these positions are the biggest gig these people have had. And I think it's about the power of it. So that, no, they don't consider who the customer is. They say, well, we're in charge. What does the customer know? I think they really believe that.
What and we're in the last few minutes, and Nick, thank you for your time. It's very much appreciated. These other people that are Labour councillors, Green councillors, Lib Dems, and all the rest, have they done previous jobs? Have they only been in politics, do you think? Unlike yourself, as you quite rightly laid out, I think the last thing you want to do is be in politics. But there comes a point to say that I'm standing up for what I believe in, for my country. Have these other people had work experience? Are they bringing life experience into this job, or is it just political and ideology is all they've ever known?
I can't say that I know them well enough to be able to comment on that. I'm sure many of them are very well-meaning people who locally, you know, work hard and try and do a good job. But I'm afraid there's too much ideology. Many of them are interested in politics because of the power that it brings and the position it brings, whether that's on a local level or on a national level. And certainly when you have MPs, you know, studying philosophy, politics and economics at university, then in the case of Labour, they would go and work for a charity or work in the public sector before getting an advisor's job, and then a hard seat, then maybe an easy seat. In terms of Tories, they study exactly the same degree.
Absolutely.
They get a job in a, you know, get a job in the media, they get a job as an advisor, and then they'd get a hard seat, then an easy seat. And it's just so tedious how common this is. You know, I'm not suggesting that we wind the clock back, but there was a lot to be said for when Britain was the only superpower in the world 150 years ago, when our country and the empire were run by a bunch of old white men who had plenty of money. They weren't doing it for the money. They were doing it because they wanted to serve their country. I'm not suggesting we should have a cabinet full of old white men, but let's not knock old white men who are doing it for the right reason. No, reformers are just a different kettle of fish. We do have people that have come out of the public sector, but the vast majority of us work in the private sector. We run businesses. In my case, a tiny business. Some of us have run huge businesses. I work for 3 multinational corporations. I've raised my family. I had a modest sporting career in my 20s. I've traveled across 6 continents. I faced adversity. You know, I've had incredible health issues that I don't need to go into, but I know what it's like to struggle. And so overall, I feel I have an enormous amount of experience to bring to bear, which career politicians just don't. And that I can say the same for many of my colleagues in Reform. In different ways, we bring a lot to the table.
I hear you. In the last, I know I've just said the last few minutes, but here's a really important question in the last few minutes. Nick, what about job opportunities? What are the employment levels in your area? What about your concern for youth employment, apprenticeships, etc.? What are your comments on that and your concerns that people having concerns along those lines in the constituency?
Well, Norwich and Norfolk is still not a bad place to live. You know, there are plenty of towns and cities that are having a much harder time than Norwich and county-wide. So, you know, it's all relative, isn't it? But the hustings I went to last month was at a place called City College, which is a fantastic organisation where young people can go to do their A-levels, but they can also go to learn how to be a hairdresser or be a bricklayer or be a plumber or an electrician. Or there's foundation courses for people going into the military or into the police force. And it's critically important for the economy of Norwich to have such a college. So we need to do more of that. And we need to encourage more youngsters to do apprenticeships. University is right for some, but very wrong for others. And it's very expensive. And it's not expensive just for the individuals, it's expensive for their whole families. We have to do more apprenticeships. One of our solutions to sorting out the NHS, for example, is we don't see why a nurse should have any sort of student debt. It's just ludicrous. If we don't see nursing as an essential key role, so much so that you can take a degree and not have a debt, I don't know where we're going wrong really, but nurses should not have any student debt. Preferably they should all be degree apprenticeships, earning from day one and doing what nurses always used to do, is learning on the job, like my mother did when she was studying nursing in the 1950s.
Right.
So you asked about young people and what our plans are locally. So more colleges like City College, more apprenticeships, and there just aren't enough apprenticeships. No one needs to go to university to be an accountant. The big firms are saying, I don't want a graduate, I want an 18-year-old. I do not want them to be messed around by university. I want them at 18. These are the smart firms of accountants. Lawyers never used to go to university. Architects never used to go to university. They used to do articles. Very different thing altogether. So yeah, we have lots of ideas how we can help young people have less debt, have less cost in their lives, so that they can think about buying a property, think about partnering up, and think about having a family. The best thing that young people can do for their country is to have children. We need to enable them to do that.
Nick, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for giving me your time and for laying out very clearly your vision and why you are then standing as the prospective parliamentary candidate for Reform UK in Norwich North. And I pray I've just got that right, instead of saying Norfolk, but in Norwich North. So can you just, as we go, can you just remind everyone again where they can reach you, where they can find you?
You can find me on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, or you can email me. Now, it's Reform UK at Norwich North is my email address. Norwich North, I'll get this right, Norwich North at reformuk.com.
Okay, brilliant. And I also congratulate you from being on TikTok. That is a real inspiration to all of us, are of the wonderful young age as yourself. So I congratulate you for that. But no, it's brilliant. And thank you again. I'll play us out, and I'll say goodbye to you on the other side. But Nick, I'll say again, thank you for your time. So please click like, subscribe, and share this. This is an important resource when you sit down and have a wonderful discussion and find out about why someone is standing, why they are making the sacrifice of that, because it's a huge sacrifice of time, and discovering the motivation to doing that and their beliefs behind that. Nick, it's been a privilege, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all.